Ladies and gentlemen, we have with us today Mr. Tim McGlue, all the way from France. Um, and go ahead and tell me a little bit about yourself. I always like to tell authors to, spill all their life secrets to me before we hear about your books.
Well, okay. Yes, you're right, man. I do live in France. This is Le Havre, by the way, which is a port town facing yeah, west, New York, and about the same parallel, actually. I've lived in France. I'm American, as you can probably tell. I was born in the States and moved around a lot with my family, mainly in the origin of the family is Upper Michigan, on the lakes up there, which is where my book is taking place in Wisconsin and Minnesota, up there in the Great Lakes. That's it. And after a childhood in the Great Lakes and growing up in Chicago, went east to school, and then in about the 70s, early 70s, came to France, and lo and behold, I stayed. Went back often to the U.S. and I did go back for a 3 year stretch to do some post grad and handle all that. And but then I decided I'm not going to go stay in the States. I'm going to come back to France. But I've lived around, and
Okay.
I've written ever since I can remember writing, but and mostly short stories and I'd say short stories, novellas, and had some published in the 80s when I was working on this. And then I came back to France and met my wife, founded a family, and I did that. That took a little while, raising, and finally got back. That's when I put away my notebooks, and I finally got back to writing a bit later. And I decided that I'd never written a novel. So I decided to go ahead and do this novel, Mixed Blood, Last Winter in America, which is about my Ojibwe ancestor, William Warren, on my mother's side. My mother was born on the White Earth Chippewa Reservation in Minnesota, as were my grandparents, and moved to Upper Michigan after the 20s, their childhood. After the war, she met my dad, who was from Upper Michigan as well, um, but he was of Irish origin. So that's why the name McGlue comes up.
Mhm.
The Warren clan all derives from my mother's family. And when I was a boy, I always had this literature or documentation about William Warren around the house. There was very little at the time, but he was already well known, and he was sort of the family hero. And because he was on the Minnesota State Legislature, and he wrote this book called The History of the Ojibwe People, which was the first of its kind. He was mixed blood, right? That's the whole point of the story.
Mhm.
Of born of a trapper American father and Ojibwe Chippewa, same thing, and part French mother, raised on the point, what we call now it's Madeline Island, just on the far western tip of Lake Superior. And when in later years, my aunt and my mother gave me this little pile of documentation on William Warren, which a little booklet and everything, and said if anybody's ever going to write anything about William, Uncle William, it's going to be you. So I finally did. I decided to go ahead and do that. And it took me many a year. And when I finally got back to it, well, that's when I found the publisher, um, which was a long find as well, Lewis Torres at Polyverse,
Mhm.
and who I think you know. Yeah,
Yeah,
Lewis.
I actually had him on recently. We had a nice chat.
Great. Yeah. All right. Well, Lewis liked it, and I originally wrote this as a novel that is pretty much in the form of, let's say, they call it the ring form. So the novel that I wanted to publish actually was roughly about two-thirds of the book. And then I told Lewis, well, I also did the history of his boyhood in the end of the Trapper era, because he was born in 1826 and grew up on that island when the trappers, all the game disappeared. And he spoke Ojibwe fluently. He was raised among the Ojibwe by his mother and by his ancestors, and didn't speak English until later. He was sent east to New York by his father, along with his brother and a couple cousins and sisters, for education. That was when he was 12 years old. And he did that at Oneida Institute, which was led by abolitionist Beriah Green. So he actually came of age in this abolitionist institution called Oneida, where there were many, many Negroes, as they said at the time, and blacks. And it was Beriah Green's point to educate all races and all colors equally. And so there were natives, Indians as they call them back in those days, and free black people. Even the black girl at the end. And then that school went down, and he went back and helped his father. He ran out of money, spent all his father's money, and then he went back and said, "That's the only thing I can do now is help out my family," which he did, and his mother's family especially, because the expansion of the United States, what they called at the time the policy of manifest destiny, which is sort of still running. But they don't call it by that name anymore, was leading to the disappearance of the Ojibwe and many, many more. This is before the Far West now. This is he came back about in the 30s. What am I saying? In the 40s, and stayed there in Minnesota, and became an advocate, as you were, an activist, as an interpreter, and mainly an interpreter of the Ojibwe people in treaty negotiations. Treaties are what they used at the time to supposedly buy the land. And that's when they began the policy of reservations. And William Warren, was certain that that was going to happen. And he was certain that they were going to have to fight for good land, their home. But if they resisted, they would be eliminated, which later happened to many, many of the native peoples as the U.S. pushed west. But the big immigration push was in the 1840s.
So, what would you say is the main conflict of your novel?
William was of mixed blood. He was of Ojibwe and white origins, and he was a man caught between two cultures. The main conflict is between those two cultures, and in William himself, between his heart and his mind, let's say. I think he was pretty much astride those two cultures, which is a story that makes him very, very interesting. And he gathered all the stories of the Ojibwe, of his forefathers, his grandfathers and grandmothers, and transcribed them into English for the whites to read. And that was the first of its kind sort of book. and he tried to sell it. He tried to publish it in New York, this huge manuscript. But he had an accident when he was interpreting in the woods, and he had a lung wound, and he was going downhill fast at the ripe old age of about 24, 25. So he worked very, very hard and had many a political conflict in the territorial legislature because he was elected, it's true, and he was the first Native American to be elected to a territorial legislature because he was an eloquent speaker, and he had a gift for making friends, let's say, making friends. But his allegiances were afire. And he had a very, very good friend from his boyhood called Maganagizig. And that was Hole in the Day was the name of the chief, who was, his father was Hole in the Day, the elder, and he was Hole in the Day, the younger. His father was a famous warrior and against the Dakota Sioux at the time. But they were always advised, Hole in the Day advised them, and Warren advised them not to try to resist the government because they would be slaughtered. Hole in the Day was a very, very interesting person and a very influential Ojibwe at the time. He lived longer. He lived on after the Civil War, and he helped to found the White Earth Chippewa Reservation, Ojibwe.
Okay.
So that conflict, the crux of the story, that one that interested me, is that when he finally finished his book, which was partly published in the newspapers of Minnesota at the time, in installments, when he finally put it together as a book, he had to publish it, and this was in 1853 at the time, and he was actually dying of what they called consumption at the time, which was, well, they didn't call it tuberculosis, but that's what it was, and his chest wound. So he was going fast, and he said, if I'm ever going to get this published, I've got to do it myself. So here's the story that interested me was that he decided in the winter of 1853 that he was going to take that manuscript to New York, and he was going to get it published, and he could only do it himself because there was no post office and there were no connections between Minnesota and New York City. That's where all the publishers were. So he did it. He picked up and left, and he crossed the Great Lakes in February. And then nobody really knows from then on how he made it, but we know he made it because of the letters that he wrote from New York, and on his way back from Chicago, or from Chicago, he wrote the last letter. And he got back, and the manuscript was actually lost, but found years later and published in the 1880s for the first time. And it's become a classic. It's still published today. You can still get it. The history of the Ojibwe people.
So I'm seeing a lot of parallels between you and him, mainly author, perhaps someone caught between two cultures. Tell me a little bit about how, because you said it's a historical fiction, so there's obviously fiction intermingled with the past. So tell me how maybe your life has influenced the stories that you wrote in this novel, as well as, maybe what you're feeling a little bit right now being an expat living in France.
Well, I'm pretty well American, and I've kept all my American traits. Many of the stories that I've lived in a few different places, and a lot of the stories that I've written take place outside of the United States, because actually, come down to it, that's what I, in my life, know best. So they take place in Crete, in Greece, in Mallorca, in France. They take place around the Mediterranean. Um, they're the things that I know, although they're fiction. I'm principally a fiction writer, and this is a historical fiction. And it took me a lot of research, and believe you me, that's the first historical fiction that I've ever tried to do, and it is a slog. But I made research trips. It was great. To Minnesota, I went on his trail. I found where he had his cabin. I spent a lot of time in the Minnesota Historical Society and the Newberry Library in Chicago, and it was a great adventure. And I suppose that, well, since I had a sort of a bad accident a few years ago when I was closing down the novel, and when I figured I'm going to have to go ahead and publish this, though there is a certain parallel, which is what Lewis finds interesting, and what a few of my friends have mentioned between my own story, which is spending a life writing and then wanting to get this one book published because I admire William Warren as a hero, before something worse happens to me. So, so I did, and nothing worse has happened to me. I came back, so I'm all right. I'm all right. I'm up and I wouldn't say running, but I'm walking and I'm writing, and that's good. That's good enough for me. I'm also playing a lot of music these days.
Awesome. Yeah, I
Yeah,
like your guitar collection in the back. That's pretty cool.
yeah. So,
Tell me a little bit again about your research. So, having it be a historical fiction, you have to have a certain amount of fact in it, I'm sure, or else people would just call
oh
it
yeah,
straight fiction. So, what would you
oh
say
yeah.
are some of the most interesting facts that you came across while you were doing your research?
Well, the fact is that he's decided this to make this trip. He does meet some publishers in New York, and he gets back. And that's the most interesting fact. He gave up on politics when he realized that everything he was striving for in the legislature was not working. He was up against, well, let's call it a lobby of traders and land grabbers, including the governor and many, many famous people at the time before statehood of Minnesota. He realized that he was getting nowhere like that, and that if he didn't publish his history to preserve the memory of the people, which is what his Ojibwe grandfathers told him to do, you know how to do it. You write it down, they said, and our words will live forever. So that's what he did. I thought that was a very heroic thing to do. And he dedicated his life to it, after all, his mother's people. And I thought that made a damn good story. I thought that made a damn good novel. The fact that he actually did not in his lifetime get it published, but that he made it back to St. Paul, probably totally exhausted, and died the very next day at his sister's house, was to me a meaningful circle.
Yeah.
So he made that ring voyage, which to me makes almost a perfect novel. And in a certain sense, I drew a lot of, well, let's say, inspiration structurally from the Odyssey, and from reading a lot of history, a lot of classics, and a lot of well, I would say historical viewpoints. There was a great book by Joseph Campbell, who did a lot of anthropological research and published many books. It's called A Hero with a Thousand Faces. And he makes a structure for the hero, the multicultural hero that you find in India, that you find in North America and South America, that you find in Homer, that you find that we keep going back to that voyage, that ring structure, where they set off and they have obstacles they have to overcome, and they do overcome. And that is a story of, for Campbell, that is a story of what myth is about,
Mm-hmm.
right there.
Awesome. So you had mentioned previously that you had written short story compilations and stuff like that. So how has it been different for you to write a novel versus those?
Well, the novel, of course, was historical, so that required a lot of research, as we were saying, and then structuring very, very tightly so people don't get bored, and stick to itiveness. Actually, that's what it takes. And then you have to, at a certain time, realize that you have a certain amount of freedom even within the structure of historical fiction, and decide who is real and who is not real. I mean, Warren meets in the novel part, which actually begins in it's in chapter 13. That's where the original book was. And then Lewis wanted to add the whole first part, which was all history of his boyhood and up to the moment where he abandons politics, which is interesting as, yeah, all get out. That's for sure. It really is. And it's historical fact. It's recorded, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have his daguerreotype, which is, that's a painting by Tim Anderson, which is taken from the daguerreotype of Warren back there behind me. And that sort of structure has to be in your mind all the time and where you're going. But I had to make a lot of it up because it was unknown how he made it to New York, the time he spent in New York, and then how he made it back. So I had to do all that research and imagine it, actually. So he goes through what they call the burned over region of New York, upper New York State, in the absolutely brand new railroad that was recently opened then, and goes right through Rochester, Buffalo, Rochester, Albany, and he meets on the train Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, who worked often together on the Underground Railroad, and actually helps them to see a young slave or runaway slave, a young woman, to freedom on the other side of the lake on his way. And in that adventurous part, he wants to bond with Douglass and with Tubman because he sees there's a parallel. He understands there's a parallel, and he decides to help the blacks, although his mission is to help the Ojibwe, the red man, the red people. And that's so there are real people, including the governor. Hole in the Day is in it. The governor of Minnesota is there. A few people, Stewart, etc. A few political figures at the time of the territories. And he meets Putnam in New York. And so there are real people. It has to be plausible. That's the problem of writing it. I had to make sure that they knew each other, Tubman and Douglass, and there was every possibility and every probability that that's the way he went, because he got there fairly quickly in 2 or 3 weeks over the winter lakes and through New York. That's pretty astounding. He had a little help from Laudanum, excuse me. That is in the book, and that was a real opiate at the time. It was very easy to get, as opiates are these days on prescription. And he didn't actually he never would have taken it because he was a teetotaler, and there's alcohol in tincture of laudanum. And his sisters knew that, but they managed to plant some sweetener for his herb teas as he traveled. And the laudanum which eases your chest pain and eases your pain in general, and it facilitates your breathing, got him to New York. Then he ran out. Anyway, that's my story, okay? But I had to make sure that all that was plausible.
Yeah.
Plausible, probable. It's very probable that he took the train. Very probable, or else he couldn't have made it in February of 1853 over New York State. He,
Yeah.
of course, made it over the lakes, hitching on different kinds of boats where he meets industrialists that existed and gets to be the sort of companion intellectual on these lake boats, these steamers, from the tip of Lake Superior in the west, all through Superior on a schooner, down through Huron, and then from Detroit on through Erie to Buffalo. That's what the, and there's a map of this. There are several maps in the book, and there's a map where you can trace his voyage. And that's all, by the way, I just want to put in a plug. It's all, by the way, in my Facebook page, which I've invented just recently. So you can go to Facebook People, Mixed Blood Last Winter in America.
If you send me that link, I'll put it in the description to this video so people can just click it.
Okay, great. Because there it's like a companion, and you can get all those maps and all the illustrations that are in the book, because there are many illustrations that are historical illustrations and whatnot, plus art by Tim Anderson. And Lewis did a great job putting the book together, I think.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
Fine job.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about your experience with Polyverse. How did you find them, and how has it been getting published with them?
Well, I found them through a friend of mine, who, because I thought that I'll go ahead and I'll self-publish this thing if I have to, because I kept, I had too many refusal letters, and I had a few bites, let's say, but mostly they were afraid of touching it because William Warren is actually controversial because he's a mixed blood. There are several very conservative people on the native side who don't believe that Warren was qualified or valid to write the history of the Ojibwe people because he was part white. And either he couldn't do anything right, because either he was too much Indian or he was too much white. So he had to deal with that. And in the end, I even had some, I had some negotiations with some editors who said, he's not a well-liked figure, which is not really true at all, because there's a lot of information on William Warren on the internet now, and in many, many different sites. And you can get his pictures, his letters, all his letters you can get at the University of Wisconsin. That when I was doing the research in the beginning, I couldn't get that. But I met Teresa Schenck, his biographer, and she's the one that facilitated a lot of things for me. She's great, Teresa Schenck. Great book, too. Great historian. UW at Madison.
Okay.
And and she was great. So that facilitated my research quite a bit. And then, of course, the internet, bam, did everything else.
Yeah.
So now it's easier. Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your writing habits then.
Well, my writing habits are as concentrated as I can get them. I tend to write in the morning, and that's when I have the energy together to do all that. And then I have to keep up with all the the Facebooking and all that. On the Facebook site, you can get all these maps in full color and blow them up, and plus it's a reader's companion. So you can get into articles about laudanum. I just put one up. articles about abolition and articles about Douglas and, who they were, photos, et cetera, et cetera. And some events that certainly, concern a lot of the fight for the advancement of the Native cause today, more than, and it goes on. I was happy to see that for when the book was finally published, I went back to the White Earth Reservation last year and presented them with the book to the tribe, and I was happy to see that the White Earth Chippewa tribe, which is a big reservation in Minnesota, is doing very well. We're great conservationists, reservationists. Fantastic. That was really heartwarming. So my writing habits still concern mourning and sticking to it. Sticking to it is what it's about.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm actually leaving it to Lewis to publicize the book and to get it out there, which he has gotten it out there. That's for sure. It's print on demand. It's available all over, especially at Polyverse. But of course, there's Facebook, Barnes and Noble, not Facebook, but what's the other guy there? Amazon,
Mm-hmm.
all that stuff. It's all out there. So Lewis
Awesome.
put that up. So I was put in touch with Polyverse through this friend of a friend of a friend when I decided I wanted to self-publish. And she said, try Polyverse. And I said, okay. And Lewis seemed to understand pretty quickly when I sent him the typescript what motivated that story and what that story was about. And he was willing to take it on, despite his controversial side. And the title of the book, against which I was advised many times by some of my beta readers, Mixed Blood, they were telling me, the readers in America, oh, you want to stay away from that. That's a hot potato these days. You don't want to go for that. And actually, Lewis liked it. He said, yeah, and I think we agree on that. Yeah, it's controversial. Yeah, it's controversial. Yeah, it's, of course, being divided among two cultures in this day and age is. It's, I'm not going to say that he was one of the first actually woke people, because the woke is a modern phenomenon, the woke virus, as they call it now. But you can get woke in all kinds of directions, and that's what makes things controversial as well. And we think that controversy opens your mind, and it makes you
Mm-hmm.
see different sides, which was Warren's. Well, it was what he hoped to do. Let's say was to open the white minds to the native mindset as well.
So, if that's what Warren wanted to do, what would you say is the point of your book? What do you hope that readers take away when they read your book?
Well, I would hope that it's a bit of a continued story of William Warren, and that they wake up to what, excuse the term, wake up, that they realize that this is an ongoing struggle. The America is made up of so many different ethnic roots that that's the heart of the problem of America. And I wouldn't call it a race problem. I would call it what they don't call manifest destiny, but I mean destiny. But I would call it it's a problem of domination of culture. Some people still call that, and they're probably right on that, white supremacy. That's what it is. You have to get where William's head was, and he had to realize how he was being treated, because he looked a lot like a native, but he wore a suit and everything. He tried to play the white man's game, but no matter where he went, he always got treated as a native and by the whites and shut out. He was not in the brotherhood.
Hmm.
He was not in the brotherhood, and that's what we got to, that's what we have to face today. The brotherhoods are all changing, as we all know. So I'd like people to think about that at least. And it's the story of mixed blood is that's the conflict, the conundrum, and the sort of tragedy of what I'd like readers to take away from this. Plus, I hope they have a hell of a good read.
Absolutely. Speaking of a hell of a good read, I'd like to invite you to read an excerpt from your manuscript if you like.
Yeah, I'd like that, Matt. Thanks. With pleasure. I'm going to skip over the whole historical part, and I'm going to read the first paragraph. That'll be enough, I think.
Awesome.
Or the first couple paragraphs of chapter 13, which is called False Thaw, which is the day that he decides to leave for New York. And he decides that it's in part 2, which is called Mississippi. And that was a territory of Minnesota and the Mississippi River in 1853. You can get that map in color online. Chapter 13, False Thaw. He's 27 years old. In Two Rivers, Minnesota, February 1853. At the first sign of an improbable thaw in deep winter, William Whipple Warren rose from what otherwise would be his deathbed to follow a water droplet descending an icicle through the wavered glass of his cabin window. Outside, the morning air shone bluegill gray, as shafts of sunlight struck the ice-braced branches with white fire. He gazed at the brilliant world in the droplet, moving slowly, then faster, toward the snowy ground below. The power in a man, sits alone, had told him, sleeps until he rises. He pressed his last notes into his case and told his wife and children by the fire that he would leave the next morning. First to St. Paul, then to Bad River to see his sister Mary. There he would find a boat, cross the Great Lakes to the east, then travel overland by railroad to New York City, the big salt water. Silence. His wife Matilda looked at him disbelieving and said, "You planned this." "The big salt water," he said again. "Maybe 2,000 miles all told." And there
Wow,
he goes.
awesome. I'll give you a little round of applause for that.
Thanks, man.
All right, Tim. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Any final comments before I let you go?
Boy, I have so much to say. This has been a pleasure. I'm so glad to. I keep harking back to the States. You know, I'm very, very American, as you can see, and it's been a pleasure. And I hope that this goes far and wide. I've watched a few of your podcasts, and I've thoroughly enjoyed them. It was great.
Awesome.
Great.
Well, feel free to share with everybody. If you've made it this far in the video, go ahead and check out Tim and the links that I leave below in the description of the video, and like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And Tim, I hope you have a great day.
Thanks, Matt. We'll be talking. Bye now.